in, unless there is a reason why you need to get out quick. Then we have a door on the south end. We have more through that door to the north end, and of course the west end, and out the back to the east, there's also a door that you can exit on in case of an emergency. But I will tell you, there's some very steep steps to go down, so if you can't take the steps, go for one of the other doors, okay? Ladies' room is right at the corner in this room. The men's room is down by the coat racks at the south end of the building. And we do have a handicap accessible bathroom right through that door where Jill's standing. Everybody knows Jill, so. Let's see here. So, everybody getting their seats? I do have to tell you that our third speaker will not be present tonight. His mother became ill and they are taking care of her. But you know what? We'll see how tonight goes. Maybe there'll be another night that we can have them back and other speakers too. We'll see. Just want to say that here at Wayside we do lots of things. One thing I want to tell you, I think it's April 6th. Mrs. Wolf is in the audience here. She now has what used to be the Walter Bowling Farm, and every year she does fireworks over there. And on the 6th, she'll open her gates up around 5 o'clock. You bring in your cars. There's a whole field for you to park so you can watch fireworks from 7 until about 9. Now, one thing that she's doing this year that I don't believe she's done before, she is asking a $10 donation per car, and that $10 will go to charities. It's going to go to the Newburgh Fire Department and Rescue Squad, the Southern Maryland Food Bank, and the Riverview Grange. And that's a word I haven't heard in a long time. So please consider going. Anybody have any questions? She's in the audience, or we can ask questions and get some answers for you. Now, I want you to know that Easter Sunday, before we went across to go to Easter services, the women were in here, and we were just putting out, fixing hospitality for after service and everything, and I made the remark that, you know what, we need one more reality show, and it should be called Those Women of Wayside. And then I realized too, you know what, we women of Wayside, we love to cook, we love to have you in here, and did I mention our spring dinner is on the 20th of April? So we'll be back in there scattering around again and cooking and ready to serve you one more time. But we also realized that there's no way we could get done what needs to be done in this parish without the men of our parish.
Here, here.
Oh boy, did he fall into that. Because now what I want to do is welcome up retired Rear Admiral Larry Poe. He's our senior warden and an absolute natural leader. We are going and growing, and he has so much to do with what goes on here. And he also gets in that kitchen and lifts those heavy pots and pans. And so, Larry, you come on up. He's our MC for this evening, and welcome you welcome.
Betty, thank you very much, and thank you for sponsoring this event tonight. What I'd like to do is to start with a short prayer. Almighty God, the fountain of all wisdom, enlightened by your Holy Spirit, those who teach and those who learn, that rejoicing in the knowledge of your truth, we may worship you and serve you from generation to generation, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Well, it is an honor for me to introduce our guest lecturer tonight, and also our special guest. What I would like to do is just call your attention on the back of your program. There's a short narrative on each individual. And what we'd like to do is to maybe hear from our guest lecturer first. Hold your questions until last, and then we'll also hear from our special guest, and we'll have more than enough time to entertain questions at the very last. So with that protocol, we'll proceed. Dr. Julia King, PhD, is an archaeologist and associate professor of anthropology at St. Mary's College of Maryland, where she researches, writes, and teaches Chesapeake and Maryland history. She has degrees from the College of William and Mary, the Florida State University, and the University of Pennsylvania. She is a past president of the Society for Historical Archaeology, and in 2003 was appointed by President Bush to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, a federal agency that advises the President and Congress on matters of national historic preservation policy. She is co-author of the book Pathways, Charles County, Maryland, 1658 to 2008. And along with her students and Michael Sullivan, who is a gentleman who is not present with us tonight, they have been involved in the search and discovery of some of Charles County's most important historic sites. She lives in St. Mary's City with her husband and I guess a new cat. I heard that the old cat passed away.
The remaining cat.
Remaining cat, okay, very well. Dr. Lord Bowling Sr. is a native of Charles County. He resides at Westwood Manor, an historically significant grant. He is Professor Emeritus at George Washington University, where he taught and chaired the Department of Speech and Drama and the Department of Speech and Hearing Science. He holds a doctorate in education from the University of Maryland. As past president of the Charles County Historical Society and past president of the County Heritage Committee, he has long held an interest in the history and preservation of the county. He was the 350th anniversary committee. He was on that committee and is responsible for producing the DVD of the county history. With that, let me introduce Dr. Julia King.
I got the mic with my person, and maybe could I get the lights? And then I think we're ready to go. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
You know, I have pretty good lungs when you teach. And those of you who are teachers, you know you have to have pretty good lungs. And I want to thank you all for, and Mrs. Bowling especially, for inviting me. She called me up one day and said, would you do this? And I thought, well, maybe if 20 people came, that would be good. I should do it. And I'm just astounded at how many people are here. And you should be here in part because your history is extraordinary. I live in St. Mary's County, grew up in Anne Arundel County, went through Charles County for many, many years, had no idea how extraordinary this place was. And this part of the county, every part of Charles County is interesting, but this part, the Wicomico, that I'll be talking about this evening, really has some interesting sites. Now, I'm an archaeologist. I'm going to try to tell a story and weave the sites that I've looked at into the story. Some of the sites I've worked at, I won't include because they're not necessarily part of the story that I'm trying to keep going, and I don't want to overwhelm you and sort of beat you over the head with every site we ever dug. But I have to tell you that you have a whole group, a fan club of students who have gone on to graduate school. Many of them are working on Charles County projects, doing your history. They grew up in Frederick County, one student's from Pennsylvania, but working here really kind of opened their eyes. You've got some of the best preserved records in the state, second only to Somerset. They're not second. Somerset County and Charles County both have the best preserved early records in the entire Chesapeake, and by entire Chesapeake I mean Virginia. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me all right in the back?
Yes.
Okay, and if I talk too fast, you can slow me down because I know I tend to do that. And I've asked somebody to serve as my remote. You know, you click your remote, but I don't have a clicker, so next slide. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, and this is my shameless huckstering, is Pathways, Pathways to History, Charles County, 1658 to 2008. That's how I first met Mike Sullivan, when he and some of the people working on this book contacted me and asked me if I would write a chapter for it. And at the time, I was like, I'm not that interested in Charles County. And then circumstances in my life led to where I had to take on some extra work. And I am so glad. You know how they always say, out of bad things sometimes comes good, and out of that situation, my husband had injured himself and couldn't work for a while. And so out of that, not only did he get better, but also I got to know all about Charles County. I have order forms for this book if you're interested. It is a very detailed historical research. It's lavishly illustrated. And it's got detailed footnoted research in it that really tells you about the county's history. I was one of 3 authors. There are 2 other authors. Christine Laurie teaches at College of Southern Maryland, and the other one, Dr. Schaefer, actually lives in Florida now, but came back to write the 20th century history of Charles County. Next slide. So, have you guys seen this picture? Who's seen this picture? Let me see hands. Who is this? Who is it? Cecil Calvert. That's exactly right. It's the 2nd Lord Baltimore. Check this picture out. I love this picture. By the way, it's owned by Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore, and you can go up there and see it. And it's this amazing portrait. He hired a guy named Gerard Soest, who was a pretty well-known court painter, to paint this. And if you look at it, you've got Cecil, and he's standing there, and he's handing a document to a boy, and then there's a older boy standing behind him, dressed in this finery. And of course, you see the Calvert colors, the orange, the red and the yellow and the black. And then you see Calvert's wearing a Persian vest, and he's standing on, it's kind of hard to see in this painting, or in my image of it, but he's standing on a Turkish rug. And then here is this young attendant from Africa, probably an enslaved person, who is waiting on the younger boy. And so he's got all these things from all these other places, you know, from Persia, from Turkey, from Africa. Next slide. And his son, or his grandson, is holding this map. You should be able to recognize what this map is of. What is it? It is the Potomac River. It's depicted that accurately based from maps that Cecil Calvert had. And he's handing this to his son. There's this incredible statement of transgeneration from the grandfather to the grandson. And look how light is used in this portrait. Notice that the light is all on, the grandson's face is completely in light, whereas the young attendant's face and Cecil Calvert's face is not completely in light, although he's got that white collar. It's just a fascinating portrait. And he never left England. He never went to Ireland, which is where, you know, Lord Baltimore's title comes from. He never went to Canada. You know, his father had a colony there. He never came to Maryland. And yet he's sort of standing in the thick of all of these things. There's nothing in this portrait that can be deemed to show his religious faith. There's nothing in here that suggests Catholicism. Very interesting. That is very interesting. This is very devout Catholic. And everything else about this sort of suggests this seamless transfer. But we know that the history of Maryland was anything but seamless. Next slide. But by the time that portrait was done, sometime around 1670, that little grandson had been born in Maryland. He had gone back over to England, where he posed for that portrait with his grandfather, and then came back to Maryland. He actually died at the age of 12. But about that time, they also commissioned Augustine Herman, a Dutchman from New York, to make this map. This is actually just a portion of the map. It's a map of Maryland and Virginia. And I'm showing you the Charles County part. You can see Charles. It was done in 1670. I suspect that map, that little Cecil, the grandson, that's little Cecil, and then there was big Cecil, is holding, is to represent this map. Next slide. And then, of course, what we're going to do is we're going to zero in on the Wicomico. Now, you could not navigate with this map, but this map is extremely detailed and very precise. I don't know that I would use it as a house location map for some of these sites, because I think he was using map conventions. But you can really see the Wicomico River. Now, as you look at this, you might say, well, why is north to the right? All of those 17th century maps put north to the right. I don't know why. We put north to the north. We put north to the north. We put north to the top. So next slide. So 1670 is a pretty good time for the Calverts. They have come through a tremendous amount of controversy beginning with the minute they get here. How many of you have been to Ocean City, and as you go across the Bay Bridge, you see that first settlement in Maryland sign, Ken Island? You all know what I'm talking about, man. In St. Mary City, we hate that sign. Have you ever seen that sign egged or defaced? It's us down at St. Mary's. It went up there around 2 a.m. Because he was an interloper, that William Claiborne. Next slide. But the great thing about Charles County, and the great sort of undervalued or under-recognized, is that it really became sort of this mixing pot between colonists, European colonists, enslaved Africans, and some Africans who were not enslaved, who came as servants, got their freedom, became landowners. One in the middle part of the county. Well, you'll hear a few of the stories this evening. And then Native Americans, some who are still in the area, others who left the area as European settlements sort of crowded them out. Charles County, unlike St. Mary's County, unlike Calvert County, really has the data, has the evidence. I'm going to sneak over here and get my water. Without water. I used to say without Diet Coke, or actually Tab. There are 4 basic food groups. Chocolate's one of them. Tab is another one of them. But in my old age, water. Water. Next slide. These are the sites that I'm going to talk about this evening. We've done a lot more, but you can see we've got the Wicomico River. And you can see that the Wicomico River, at the headwaters, of course, is the Sakai Swamp. So I'm going to talk about that as well, too. Next slide. The first site that I want to talk about is Josiah Spendle. Now, I sort of started the story about 1670. Things are going good for the Calverts. He's got that portrait done. He's had this map made. But things weren't so good before then. And Josiah Spendle was part of that. You never hear about Josiah Spendle because he's been sort of buried. Nobody wants to talk about him. Next slide. And part of the reason we don't want to is a mere decade earlier, in 1659, and I took this out of the Archives of Maryland. So as you look at it, you're going to see some language, spellings that are kind of funky. But in March of 1659, it was actually 1660 because they were on the old calendar. The old calendar began on March 25th and ended on March 24th. But look, they send this thing to the governor and the council. Now the governor is Lord Baltimore's appointed representative in the colony. And it says, this assembly, that is the Assembly of Burgesses, in judging themselves to be a lawful assembly without dependence on any other power, get ready for it, Lord Baltimore, we don't think we need you, in this province now in being is the highest court of judicature, and if any objection can be made to the contrary, we desire to hear it. They're basically saying, hey, we don't need you, and they are dissolving Lord Baltimore's power. This little Fendel's Rebellion was called a Pygmy Rebellion by the people at the time. It lasted 3 months, and the king, Charles II, restored his power. But Cecil was livid. He sentenced Fendel to death. He banished him from the colony. And then, because Cecil was a big wuss, he said, okay, if you come back and you're just starting politics, I won't kill you. So he came back and he took up residence at that spot, the mouth of the Wicomico. Next slide. So we went out there. Nobody had ever found his site, so I put one of my students on the documents. And he found this magnificent map or plat of Charleston. Do you all know where Charleston is? In fact, you go on down here, and I think it's Hatton's Landing Road. And you can see it's really quite good. Next slide. And you'll see we took a modern map and we were able to, this is a soils map, we were able to find the boundary. And we looked at the soils map, we said Fendel's going to be where there's good soil. So let's go where there's good soil. Where there's good soil, there's usually plowed fields. Next slide. So we went out there, and we went out in March this time, and it was absolutely gorgeous. I mean, unbelievably striking landscape. Next slide. But then when school's out, and you have to take the students out. You can't go out when you should be out. You have to go out when it's summer. And here's this corn, and oh my God, I love corn, but I hate corn. I'll never dig in corn again. Next slide. But you can see the shadow of the corn. We could see tobacco pipes. In the middle slide, that is a fragment of table glass. That is like a wine glass base. And then on the right, a piece of German stoneware and an oyster shell. They looked right in our time period. And so the students, using their creative, students and computers, amazing. And we went out there and we nailed the site. This is where Fendel, was doing all of his sort of machinations against Lord Baltimore, until Lord Baltimore said, stop it and stay out of politics. Next slide. And then we dug a number of units. We found all sorts of rich material culture. Fendel was not poor. He was not poor. And by the way, all these fights they're fights among rich guys, really. Next slide. All right, so Josiah Fendel, you see where he is. He's there at the mouth of the Wicomico. And the Wicomico is actually becoming a very important river in the 1650s, 60s, and 70s. And that's because the Wicomico gives extraordinary access to the interior through the Zacchaeus Swamp. People are loving the Wicomico and the Zacchaeus Swamp at this time. Eventually, that interest passes as settlement moves west. But for a brief several decades, it was a really important area. But Josiah Fendel, what was Baltimore going to do? I mean, he's got these guys up there. It wasn't just Fendel, it was some other people too. Thomas Gerard, Robert Sly, who was at Ocean Hall. So next slide. What I'm going to talk about is Notley Hall. That's Baltimore's place of power. And notice how it's right across the river from Fendel. I mean, all sorts of politics is going on in this landscape. You all can still hear me? My voice is okay. Next slide. So then we wanted to go out to Notley Hall, and Mr. Sullivan knew the man who owned the property today, and he contacted him and the farmer and asked if I could bring the students out there. And so here we are on the other side in St. Mary's County, and we're laying in our grid. Everybody knows archaeologists work in grids, and so we're out there laying in our grid to begin to collect our data. Next slide. And here we are. We dig these things called shovel tests. Our shovel tests are just a foot wide, and they're about a foot deep. We dig them, we collect the artifacts, and we move 25 feet and dig them again. And we backfill them as we go. You can hardly tell that we've been there unless you're really looking. And these shovel tests allow us to go over great spaces. If we were digging bigger units, we would never get off of those bigger units. And you can see where the flag is in the front, that red flag, that's one shovel test. And you see a couple of the crew on one shovel test and then one in the background. This is St. Mary's County. Again, it's that Wicomico River landscape. It is the best kept secret. When I was Googling to try to get pictures of the Wicomico, they took me to two other places always. One, of course, is the Eastern Shore. And then the other one is the Wicomico over in Virginia. And I'm like, you know what, I kind of like that in a way because, it's a great secret, isn't it? Maybe, and we should want to share, but, next slide. And at the bottom of one of those shovel tests, and here you see one, we found a brick foundation. We got very excited. We very rarely find brick foundations anywhere. People didn't build in brick. But Notley is Baltimore's buddy. Remember, Thomas Notley is his governor, and he's his buddy, and he's being put there he's being set there to sort of keep an eye on those rogues in the Wicomico. Next slide. Here's some of the things we found. See this little piece of glass? This is a glass and it's a piece of table glass. Next slide. And it comes from vessels like this. Next slide. And this arrow is pointing to, we call them comet prunts. A prunt is a piece of glass that's been affixed to another piece of glass. So these comet prunts, because they look like a comet, and very elaborate. I mean, here they are on the edge of the known frontier to the Europeans. And they're, drinking out of these fancy Venetian vessels. Next slide. We didn't find this, but the woman who lives next door found this on the beach. Next slide. And check this out. This is a stoneware jug with the initials WH. We don't know who that is, and it's dated. Do you see the date? 1672. This is when all of this stuff is sort of going down, and keeping eyes and not trusting. But again, it's disputes among equals, if you know what I mean, and among wealthy people. Next slide. So one of my students, we took an inventory. When Notley died, he left this amazing detailed room-by-room inventory. And we were able to map out, using that foundation that we found, and the inventory, which listed all the rooms. And you can see here, it was a 3-story structure. And it had, the names of the rooms were things like hall, room against the hall. CT stands for counting house, because Notley was a merchant. There was a 2nd floor, there was a 3rd floor, and one of my students used this amazing sort of look what it looked like back then software, and this was the hall where Notley would actually entertain Lord Baltimore, and whenever they had any business with the Piscataway, instead of meeting in St. Mary City, they would come to Notley Hall. So Notley Hall sort of became an annex to the government. And Baltimore was fine with this because he wanted Fendel to see, hey, look at me, you know, this is the government over here. Next slide. But one of the very interesting things, how many of you have heard the story about Irish Nell and Saltwater Charles? Has anybody heard the story? One person has heard the story. I think, isn't there a road right around here called Butler?
Yeah.
I know that that road is connected to this couple. Next slide. Eleanor Butler, Irish Nell, was an Irish servant. And she came to the colonies, and eventually she ends up being owned, her services are owned by William Borman. Next slide. She marries an enslaved African, a guy named Charles. They called him Saltwater Charles because he had come across the salt water, so he's newly enslaved. And this is not unusual. These guys are wealthy and they've got slaves in this early period. Not everyone does, but the elite do. Everybody has wondered, and there are there are hundreds of descendants of Irish Nell Butler and Charles and Eleanor Butler. Hundreds of descendants throughout the country. And in fact, when we were at Notley Hall, I worked with a couple of those descendants who are originally from the Upper Marlboro region, but now they live in North Carolina. Next slide. So we had always thought, well, we've got to find Borman's house. And I haven't found Borman's house yet. Well, when Irish Nell was going to marry Charles, Lord Baltimore got wind of it. And he summoned her. And we know this because of these records that survive where her grandchildren sue for their freedom. And by the way, they win because the law had been misapplied to her and Charles. Her children, when she married Charles, there was a law in Maryland that said your children would take the status of the father. Charles was enslaved, so all of their children and grandchildren would be enslaved. But that law actually changed right about that time, and her grandchildren sued to say that marriage was not consummated until after the law changed. Do you all follow? They won. It was a 7-year court case. It was about the time of the American Revolution, and the records survived. And in those records we have this. Upon my lord, this is back in the 1680s. Though, remember, because the grandchildren are, generations ahead. Upon my lord being informed, that's Lord Baltimore, that she, that is Nell, wanted to marry the Negro, my lord sent for her, and he chided her, and he told her that if she married the Negro, she would by that means enslave herself and her posterity. He was trying to use that law on her. Next slide. And this is what Nell reported to him, upon which the woman, that is Eleanor, told him that she would rather marry the Negro under those circumstances than to marry his lordship with all his country. So she's basically saying, kiss off, dude. And upon which Lord Baltimore told her she might go and marry him and be damned. And the next day, a Catholic priest in the Wicomico married them. But where did they live? Next slide. So as we were working at Notley Hall, we came across the inventory. Remember, it's a room-by-room inventory. It describes the rooms and all the stuff in it. And an inventory is something that we all do when we die, right? You have to disperse your holdings, your real estate, and your personal property. Next slide. So we're looking through this thing. Next slide. Can you guys read what that says?
Irish Nell.
It doesn't say Irish Nell, but it does say
Irish something.
An Irish wench at the house. Next slide. What does that say? Charles Negro. I think we've got our Irish, Nell, and Charles, and I think Notley owned them, and I think they lived at Notley Hall. That's where they started. They do end up with Borman, because Baltimore inherits all of Notley's things. Notley doesn't have children, he never marries. He leaves everything to Lord Baltimore, and then I think Lord Baltimore sold a lot of his stuff to William Borman, and that would have included Eleanor and Charles. Next slide. Really cool little love story that nobody knows about except the lawyers. And I'll tell you why the lawyers know. They like to look at it because they're trying to understand early law. All right, next slide. Where are we going to go now? Calvert's Summer House. Been in the news lately. I don't know if you've been hearing about it, but it's been in the news. And I'm not 100% sure that it's Calvert's Summer House. I'll tell you why. Next slide. Charles Calvert. Now you remember Cecil, and you remember Little Cecil. This is the father of Little Cecil. He is the only Lord Baltimore that comes to Maryland. Next slide. And when he comes, he writes to his father, and those letters survived. The letters his father wrote to him don't, but here is one of the letters. He says, I am now building upon your lordship's manor of Sakai, that is Sakai Manor, where I resolve to live in the summertime. Now remember, his father has never been to Maryland, and he's telling his father he's going to build a summer house. Nobody's building a summer house in Maryland. It's too hard in the 17th century to have that kind of leisure time. But by telling his father this, I think, you know how when you send your kids off to college, oh, I'm studying all the time. I think this is that version. This is the 17th century version. My resolution is to later build a brick house for little Sis, and that's that little boy in the next year. That's 1672. Things are going great. They've got the map, the portrait, building a summer house in Maryland. Things are going great. Next slide. And then so Charles writes to his father and he says, I have already built a country house. So he says he builds the summer house. We know it exists. For summertime at Sakai, according to the fashion of the building of this country. And then he says, I find building here to be very chargeable, meaning very difficult, very expensive. Next slide. So we think, did it look something like this reconstructed cabin down at historic St. Mary's City? We don't know. But that's what we sort of imagined it, because he said, after the fashion of this country. These are like fire magnets. Next slide. So then, one of my students, because I have a whiz kid student with the records, he finds this document. He finds this plat. It's called His Lordship's Favor, and it's on Sakai Manor. Now, people don't just randomly name things. His Lordship's favor means the favorite place of Lord Baltimore. But why is that? Is that because the house is there? We don't know. But we know that there are clues everywhere if we just open ourselves to them. And check it out. It showed these buildings. And we got very excited. Next slide. So I've blown it up here. It's a little bit big, but you can see it's got a chimney. And we think that that is a chimney of brick. Sakai Manor is closer to Waldorf. To have any house, when this plat was done in 1705 with a brick chimney up there, you need to take notice, because people couldn't afford to build in brick. Charles Calvert himself says, very chargeable. So if anybody could have had a brick chimney, it would have been him. Next slide. And then there was this other strange building. There were like 3 other buildings, but the others looked like outbuildings, like a dairy, service buildings. This is this weird building that has no chimney, no windows. I sent it to my colleagues at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and they immediately got excited. They think it is Lord Baltimore's summer house, and they think that this is some kind of party house, because the gentry would build these kinds of houses to entertain, sort of like a dance hall. I'm not there yet. Much as I would love it to be that, I'm not there yet. Those guys at Colonial Williamsburg are used to truly rich planters. Our planters are not on the same level. It's because of the kind of tobacco we grow. Next slide. But we went out there, we had the plat, went out there to see what we could find. Gorgeous area back there on Piney Branch. Here are some of the students. We actually used students from St. Mary's College and College of Southern Maryland. Next slide. And we started finding stuff, in the map, X marks the spot. The problem is that we didn't find a lot of stuff that we could say was early. We could get it to 1690, but remember, we have to get it back to 1673. And there was not a lot of stuff. Part of the problem is that Charles Calvert turns away from the summer house. His father dies in 75. He goes back to England. I don't think he's using it. It's referred to a couple of times more in the documents. So it could be that our little shovel test, the sample size was just too small. We dug a few larger units. Next slide. But then when we took this stuff, and here is a map. Now you're going to become an archaeologist. And each one of those little cross-hatched dots represents one of our shovel tests. Some of them are really close together. That's where we were finding all the artifacts. But you can see we sort of spread it along the way. Next slide. And so what we did was we did a map that we did the concentration of materials. There was a lot of brick there, and check it out. It's concentrating in one area. So that WizKid student, next slide, fit the plat and to that area. I mean, he was able to say, this is probably where that brick is, where that structure is, where the foundation of that structure is. We didn't spend too much time on this particular parcel. We were there 2 weeks. But we knew that this was something important and that it needed further attention. But we were doing a broad survey. We wanted to know about the whole Wicomico. And archaeology is very labor intensive. Next slide. Oh, and this was one other thing that was really interesting. Does anybody know what this thing is? It does look like a dinosaur footprint, doesn't it? It's this. Next slide. It comes from a window like this. Next slide. And what it is where the red arrow on the second slide is pointing. That's the juncture over there, and the red arrow on the left side is pointing to a little piece of glass still in there. Can you see that? It's extraordinary. So this house didn't just have a brick chimney. It had glass windows. This is outside of Waldorf in 1705. Take notice. You know, I mean, this is but we were also looking for other sites, so we had to move on. Next slide. So we had to leave behind whatever it was that we found. Next slide. And then we were also looking for a courthouse, because people were meeting at Zakiah House. That's what they called the summer house. They were also meeting in private homes. And the assembly said, this has got to stop. We've got to build courthouses. So this is how I first met Mike Sullivan. He calls me up and says, hey, you want to find the courthouse? I'm like, me and about 10,000 other people, who are you? And if you know Mike Sullivan, you don't say, who are you? But I didn't know him. Next slide. Next slide again. This is where we're going for the courthouse. Now, everybody thinks that people like to be on the river, but this courthouse is not on the river. It's in Zakiah Swamp. It's around Clark's Run. Next slide. So Mike had, all he had was this plat. I don't know if any of you have seen this plat. Among archaeologists, it's legendary. Next slide. This plat was done of the courthouse lot, and it was the same guy who did his lordship's favor plat that you just saw with the buildings. Look at the detail. The courthouse, the ordinary, PL means Philip Lines. Ordinary is just a tavern. And then the old houses. You can see an orchard. You can see the stocks. Next slide. And if you ever go to St. Mary City, you'll see that they based one of their reconstructions on this. Next slide. But nobody knew where it was. People had been looking for it since 1934. And so Mike Sullivan went to Lorenzi, Dodds, and Gunnell. He handed them all of this research, and he said, figure it out. And Kevin Norris, a surveyor there, figured out that it was on a property called Moore's Lodge, about 150 acres. And Kevin mapped out Moore's Lodge. But they still wanted to narrow it down. And that's how I got involved. When Mike said, can you go out there as an archaeologist? Next slide. So I went out there with my students, and we just started digging our shovel test pits. Next slide. And screening, and we screen everything. That we do that to standardize artifact recovery, because some people have good eyes and some people don't have as good eyes, like me. Next slide. In some areas, we just saw early stuff on the surface. I mean, we were just like, we were jumping for joy because we knew how famous this plat was. Next slide. And after a while, we found all sorts of interesting artifacts. Most of this is your typical late 17th century stuff, but that stuff with the red stripes, St. Mary City hadn't seen anything like that. So that's kind of cool. I'm not. It's a Delft ceramic. I don't know what it is though at this point. Next slide. So we mapped it out. Now you're pros at looking at these maps, and we saw that we had a couple of concentrations of of artifacts. Next slide. And I really shortened this story up for the courthouse because many of you have heard this before. And if you haven't, it's in Pathways. Have I told you about Pathways? It's this great book. Please buy Pathways. Scott Strickland took Kevin Norris's work, Our Archaeology. See the plat? He fit the plat to where that is, and that's on Barbara Howe's property. If you know Mrs. Howe, very generously let us come on her property and with my students, and we were able to fit this plat in that area. And the site is preserved. The Howes are very, very, what would you call it, very good-minded stewards about there, and they're very excited to know that this courthouse that preceded Port Tobacco. In fact, this remains the courthouse until 1727, and then the court moves to Port Tobacco. Next slide. Remember old Fendel? So Fendel's good for a little while. He's good through much of the 70s, but in 1670s, late 70s, he starts to go back to being his old Fendel ways. And he says, my Lord Baltimore, he accuses Lord Baltimore of being a traitor, that people were fools if they paid any levies to Lord Baltimore. In other words, you shouldn't pay your taxes to Lord Baltimore. Not anything. If people tell you that, don't listen. Fendel, and then this is another quote. Fendel asked, was it true that a man of war was coming in for the Lord Baltimore? They're all spreading these rumors. Was this man of war coming to take him back in chains? And then Fendel says, for if they'll just send me 2 or 3 lines, that is, just tell me to do it, I will secure my Lord Baltimore and send him home, saving that charge. And of course, Baltimore's hearing this from everyone, and he's just becoming apoplectic. Next slide. And then I like this one, that the said Fendel did several times say that he believed in his good conscience that the Catholics, or the Papists, and the Indians were going to join together to slaughter all the Protestants. And by this point, you know, imagine that cartoon character where the ears and the tongue, I mean, that's Lord Baltimore. Next slide. But there were issues with Native Americans. Our Piscataway Native Americans were under pressure from Indians, the Susquehannock Indians. So all sorts of things. 1670 started out a really good decade. By the end of the 1670s, not so good. Next slide. Fendel, you've got Indians attacking. The Indians are moved from, you'll see the red arrow, they're moved from Wyoming or Piscataway, where their original settlement is, to Zekiah Fort. Next slide. And, but where? And that was one of the reasons that we were doing all this survey. Next slide. So we crossed many properties. Next slide. And some right along the swamp. Next slide. And then we found this one particular road. We go down this road. Next slide. And as we saw on this road, there was a really defensible hill. And you know, if you have a fort, you want a defensible hill. Next slide. And not only was there a defensible hill, the property is surrounded on 3 sides by this large woodland creek. I started to get very excited. Next slide. And if you're going to move about 90 people into a fort, you need some fresh water. So there's this freshwater spring there. Next slide. So I sent the crew out there, and in fact, we didn't wait for the summer. I sent 2 of my students out there in January, and here they are digging. Next slide. And within a few shovel tests, they started finding glass trade beads. And both Indian, the red Indian pipes, and Europeans. We got so excited. And of course, you know, at St. Mary's College, everybody has to be professional and polite. So I had to like go home and scream into a pillow. Next slide. We had invited the Piscataway out because we wanted to do more testing, larger units instead of just a shovel test. Next slide. And then the crew went to work, and we did this during the summer. And you can see that they're digging a trench, and we're sort of zigzagging, doing a checkerboard effect. Next slide. And there you can see some of the units. This property has just been acquired. It was acquired at the end of December by the county. You own this property now. It's owned by the Charles County citizens, Board of County Commissioners in trust for you. Next slide. And we found all these. We found over 300 glass trade beads. We found Indian pottery on the lower left. We found tobacco pipes. We found nails. Next slide. This is where we think Baltimore moved those Piscataway Indians when they were under stress. We found more gun flints than I've ever seen at an archaeological site. You see the flint flakes, and then you see the actual gun flints. We found like 20. If I find one gun flint at a site, I'm lucky. This is a heavily armed fortification. Next slide. And then we found these wonderful triangular points. The one in the lower left is quartz, that's typical. But then these Indians were getting copper and making points out of copper. That's the green metal. And there's even one of iron there, the sort of corroded ones. Next slide. And we found this thing, this silver belt hook to a sword. How did the Indians get that? Or was this one of Lord Baltimore's rangers up there in his, silver belt hooks are not cheap to hold a sword, that you have on a belt. Next slide. And then we found this weird lead thing on the left that my students are convinced is a lead tau cross. The one on the right is actually from Florida, but I show it to give you a sense. Next slide. And then we mapped out, you're archaeologists now, we take our stuff, we feed it to the computer, and it gives us this concentration. You can see that black concentration in the middle, but there's concentrations elsewhere. We know forts tend to be about 150 by 150 feet, so I had the students make a block. Next slide. And it fit 150, sort of really gloves it, it's really nice. I don't know if that's real because we have only done so much work out there, but this is how we try to build our interpretations. Next slide. But remember I told you at the end of the 1670s things were getting bad? 1680s things get real bad. Christopher Rowsby was a tax collector for the king. Lord Baltimore's cousin stabs him to death in a ship in the Patuxent River. If you don't pay your taxes, you definitely shouldn't kill the tax collector. You really shouldn't. And then John Coode, who sort of rose up and eventually, there's a long story, but he seizes control of the colony. And they build on those rumors. So in 1688, William and Mary come to the throne in England. And in 1689, next slide. In 1689, there's Lord Baltimore, Charles Calvert, his father's dead. He's in England now. So he's not even here to sort of control things. 1689, next slide. A group of Protestants seize the State House in St. Mary's City. It's bloodless, next slide. But they realize that they have to move to Mattaponi, which is on the Patuxent, because that's where Lord Baltimore's principal house was. And that's where the armory was. That's where the weapons of the colony were kept. But they didn't stop there. Next slide. They then marched to Notley Hall, because Notley Hall symbolized the proprietor's rule in Maryland on the Wicomico. Next slide. So one of the last sites I'll talk about very briefly, next slide, is Westwood House. Next slide. And this site, as you can see, one of the students has mapped out the original pattern. The dot shows where Mr. and Mrs. Philip Harrison went to build their house. This is a glass bottle seal from that house, IB or JB for John Bain. Next slide. And you can see their house in the background, and you can see where she's sort of been doing some digging. And it wasn't a real archaeological dig, but she loaned us her collection so that we could analyze it. Next slide. And one of the most extraordinary things was this vessel. This thing is about this big. It's a big, large jug. Next slide. And on it is this face of King William. Whoever is living at this house, John Bain and his wife, who is the widow of Thomas Gerard Jr., they're saying, we believe in the king. In other words, we support the Protestant Revolution. Next slide. 1692. This should look familiar. The Protestant Revolution brings about all sorts of changes. The Anglican Church is established in Maryland. And of course, your parish, William and Mary Parish, comes out of that. The Wicomico River history could keep on going. Next slide. But we don't have all night, and I know that there's all sorts of other things to hear. We did have, when we found Sakaya Fort, many of you may have been there, an event at Mount Victoria, where my students were able to display some of the artifacts for Governor O'Malley. Next slide. And we also had the Piscataway, members of the various Piscataway Indian tribes and nations in there, and it was just a magnificent day. Next slide. And all of these people And I had to like make the font smaller and smaller, and there are people that aren't on here that I should have included on here, but these are all people who have let us on their property. And I am very grateful to them. I'm grateful to Mike and Laura Sullivan for the funding, the work that we've done out of their own pockets. And then all of the other folks who have let us on their property, who have talked to us, who have showed their collections to us, or in the case of Mrs. Bowling, not just shown the collection, but allowed me to come out here and speak to you tonight. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we have to
Why don't we invite Dr. Bowling up to do his presentation, please.
All
Give me
right.
assistance on that.
Huh? No, I'm gonna get mine.